Good evening, and welcome to a Shelby conversation. Why Shelby? An extensive look at the Shelby versus Holder decision and the decision that really gutted the Voters' Rights Act of 1965. So, we're going to have a candid conversation with the NAACP and many of our friends and partners from around the country. We are elated to be here today. I'm Omar Neal, the former mayor of Tuskegee, Alabama, the host of the You Got the Power Talk show, and a moderator for The Cutting Edge. Today, we're going to have an extraordinary conversation about a pivotal decision that has placed itself at the forefront of our democracy. We believe that this decision is an existential threat to our democracy, and we'll discuss why. But before we do any of that, I'd like to go to the national space and bring up a attorney for the General Counsel, Attorney Anthony Aston, who will come and bring greetings from the National NAACP. Good evening, Attorney Aston.
Good evening, Mayor. How are you?
Doing great, man. And thank you so much for joining us today. This is a incredibly important conversation, and I'm so glad that the National NAACP is on board in advancing this dialogue so that we can really educate and sensitize our community to the threat to democracy that this decision has caused. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, to give a quick background for your audience, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted to prevent certain jurisdictions from making changes to the procedures or practices of their elections without first being cleared by either the Attorney General or being vetted by a federal court, and that federal court being the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. The proposed changes would have to be found that they would not have a discriminatory purpose or discriminatory effect. The following states were covered by that, and it's no surprise that the states that fell under that coverage. It was Alabama, Alaska, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia. And there were other subdivisions of states that were also covered by this pre-clearance requirement, and those jurisdictions in California, Florida, New York, North Carolina, and Michigan. As a matter of fact, in North Carolina, there were 40 counties that had a history of discrimination against Black people in voting, and therefore were included as one of those jurisdictions that required pre-clearance before they could make changes. And those changes would include changing polling places or changing voting laws, eligibility to vote, doing new maps for political districts. The reason for this is because it's to prevent people from coming up with things such as saying, we're going to change your polling place the week before the election. Thus making it more difficult to find out where you're going to vote. keeping them from doing things such as saying, we're going to put your polling place within a sheriff's office with the idea that hopefully you'll be intimidated and will not vote. So in June 2013, the Supreme Court struck down the coverage formula for Section 5 in a case called Shelby County versus in a 5-4 decision. The court said that it was out of date. Now, this is despite the fact that Congress had determined that it was still needed. So what was the aftermath of this? It was exactly as you would suspect. You had these same areas beginning to pass laws to make it more difficult to vote. For example, within hours of the decision, the Texas Attorney General, who is now the governor of Texas, announced that with today's decision, the state's voter ID law will take effect immediately. Redistricting maps passed by the legislature may also take effect without approval from the federal government. The result being that the Texas State Conference of the NAACP and others filed a lawsuit. Matter of fact, one of the lawyers for that is actually on your call today. That's going to be Gary Bledsoe, who is the president of the Texas State Conference. The Fifth Circuit agreed with the district court. Well, it reversed the district court, saying it could not find under the formula that it had, the formula that was used, that there was a racially discriminatory purpose, and it remanded it for the court to look at that again. But it did find that the bill that was passed had a discriminatory effect. It negatively affected Black people and disproportionately Black people. Within 2 months of Shelby being ruled upon by the Supreme Court, the North Carolina legislature passed a law that instituted strict voter ID requirement, curtailed early voting, eliminated same-day voter registration, restricted pre-registration, ended annual voter registration drives, and eliminated the authority of county boards of elections to have the polls open for an extra hour. The Fourth Circuit, when affirming this and saying, when affirming the decision that said that this was a violation of Voting Rights Act, notice it actually said that the new provisions target African Americans with almost surgical precision. They constitute remedies for the problems, assertedly justifying them. And they said they impose cures for problems that did not exist. As I think one of the things that North Carolina had done was it actually hired a consultant to look at how Black people voted, looked at how they registered, looked at when they voted, and then they created a law that eliminated those things to make sure, or do the best they could to make sure that Black people did not vote.
So the whole thing was about voter suppression, and that's what this was all about, right?
Well, and that goes on today. That a lot of it is about voter suppression. Remember, if you don't think you can win with the majority of the votes, then try to keep people from voting.
Right.
That seems to be the plan.
So the whole notion initially was that it was no longer needed, and right after it was struck down, the floodgates kind of opened up of voter suppression measures, right?
Right. It's kind of like the fox saying, "There's no need for you to close the door to the hen house. Trust me, I'll be okay."
That's wonderful. I thank you, sir, for laying it out. It was important that we kind of set the stage, and you could not have done a better job in setting the stage for a robust conversation that we're going to have. Thank you so much, and thanks to the NAACP on a national level for all that you do to help us to bring about justice in this country. All right. Well, let's look at our extraordinary panelists. We have a panel that's out of this world. If you could bring up our panel, I want to introduce them. We're going to be having this conversation with people who have intricate knowledge of the Shelby case. First, Dr. Vanessa Enoch, who is the founder of Cultural Impact LLC out of Cincinnati, Ohio. we have Attorney Gary Bledsoe, who is the president of the Texas State uh, Conference, and as well as a member of the National Board of NAACP. We have City Councilman Ernest Montgomery, who is going to be very pivotal to this case because he was the person who really led in terms of challenging Shelby County early, that ended up with a lawsuit that ended up in the Supreme Court. And so we'll talk about the genesis of the Shelby case, why Shelby. And then, of course, we have Attorney Marcia Johnson, who is a Lawyers Community Voting Rights Project. She's with them, and she has integral knowledge of this as well. So, welcome all to a conversation about Shelby. All right, you all can unmute. Let me start out with you, Councilman Montgomery. You I want you to tell us your story because your story was quite compelling to me when I was first told that it was your election that was the impetus of this Shelby case. Tell us what happened with you.
Okay, thank you, Mayor Neal. I put together, I kind of wrote down some things that happened back, we're talking now in 2008, trying to have a good memory of what happened exactly, not knowing that it was going to spawn the case, the challenge that came from Shelby County. But so I wrote down a few things to kind of explain what happened that led up to this point. And I'd just like to read that off if it's okay with you all. Okay, it says, again, everyone, I bring you greeting from the city of Calera, which is located in the southern part of Shelby County. I'm a city councilman here, and I represent District 2. I believe the Shelby versus Holder case filed in 2011 stemmed from the situation we had in our municipal election in 2008. In 2007, our city redrew its district line, resulting in the elimination of the only or the sole majority district in the city. We have 5 districts here. The newly drawn lines changed the minority makeup from a 69 to a 29% decrease. After submitting those changes to the Department of Justice or to the federal courts for pre-clearance, we were denied. The findings were from them that those changes clearly disadvantaged the minority voting community. I learned later that year that the city mayor had our city attorney to resubmit those approvals and went forward with the municipal election without being cleared. That resulted in a lawsuit against the city and a disqualification of our election. In that election, I lost my seat, but learned that the election was voided. I traveled to the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. alongside our city attorney at the request of my constituents and the city council to find some solution to the problem. After a solution was found and accepted under the pre-clearance section of the Voter Right Act, the city held a new election in 2009, which I was able to regain that seat. And I, as well as my constituents, were very thankful for the oversight from the BRA and for making sure that we have fair and inclusive elections for all people. But as you all know,
All right, let me say an extraordinary story, and so what you're saying is that they changed some things that you believe caused for you to be defeated, and they did not get proper clearance from the federal government at this time or the Department of Justice, and that was the basis of your winning your position, right? Is that correct, I want to make sure because you were breaking up a little bit. All right, we'll come back. We'll come back to him. I want to start with you, President Bledsoe. This notion of preclearance is tricky because it's rooted in this notion of states' rights and federalism, and that states should have the autonomy to do certain things, and because you have carved out certain states, they said that that would be unfair to those states because of the fact that other states could very well have had challenges as well, and it was so long ago. It was 1965. Well, man, we're in 2013 now. That stuff's over with. And so that, I guess that's the argument that they were making. Am I wrong? Is that too simplistic?
No, Mayor, I think that summarizes it real well, because that is effectively the argument that they use to invalidate really Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which made Section 5 inoperable, and it, of course, unleashed a whole lot of different kinds of shenanigans that people have been engaging in all around the country. And, the irony in that, I think you were getting at that in terms of how you set up the question. The irony of a Shelby County with a history of discrimination that was continuing to the present day, being able to stand for the rest of the country and raise the issue about there are good political subdivisions or political entities that should not be covered is, to me, outrageous. For example, if you have really systematic discrimination in a workplace against women, do you allow a man to bring the claim? I don't think so. That's not what normally happens. But in this case, good old discriminatory Shelby County was able to actually do that, and it was a dishonest opinion. I know I was so offended in the opinion when I went up to the arguments. I saw President Simulton up there, but the reference from Chief Justice Roberts that blacks in Mississippi had it better in terms of their ability to vote than blacks in Massachusetts, and it just pulling that from the sky. And it was such an outrageous comment, but there was a nefarious statistic that had given rise to the Chief Justice saying that. But that is very true. That is, and then one final point on that: this principle that they use to invalidate Section 4 about the equality for the different sovereigns around the country, I think is somewhat nefarious and didn't really apply. And was simply, they needed some way to eliminate Section 5, and so they chose this questionable principle about equality for the sovereigns to actually invalidate the provision. And so it is somewhat outrageous. It's a real example of what I would call judicial activism.
You are absolutely correct. I want to go to you, Attorney Johnson, because President Bledsoe is correct that it was like the fox telling them that leave the chicken house open. We know that discriminatory measures to suppress the vote has never dissipated in this country. That is not just relegated to Alabama. Obviously, it's all over. But it opened the floodgates. It gave those states permission to be more overt in suppressing the vote. Couldn't they have foreseen that?
I think they could have. One of the things that Justice Roberts wrote in the Shelby opinion says discrimination in voting continues to exist. He acknowledged that. And the fact that then the court refused to look at that record of discrimination, because that's something that we were prepared for. We spent years before reauthorization collecting that record of discrimination to show the court that discrimination continued. And so, what the decision did, as Attorney Ashton said, Texas was particularly brazen because with their voter ID law, a law that had been found discriminatory not once but twice under the pre-clearance regime, they instituted it the same day. And then we had states like North Carolina that passed their monster voting law, as it was called at the time, which went across the board, not just at ID, but at several means of being able to vote early, being able to have your ballot count at a precinct. Georgia followed suit with passing onerous laws. And what we've seen happen recently as well is that they are so emboldened, these states that pass these restrictive voting laws, that they look at how people of color are voting, how Black people are voting, and they go specifically after those means. In 2020, in the pandemic, we opened up the ability, more opportunities to vote. Remember, states were sending voters absentee ballot applications, sending absentee ballots. African Americans, for the first time in Georgia, voted more by absentee ballot than white voters. We had ballot boxes. Harris County in Texas, instituted drive-by, drop off your ballot, all found to be very secure. And right after the 2020 elections, these states again doubled down and now make it harder to vote by absentee ballot. In Georgia, you have to have an ID. In Texas, you have to have an ID. They've taken away the opportunity to have ballot boxes. They've started criminalizing the vote. We're not going to provide resources in certain communities, so you're going to have hours-long lines. And if the community steps up and says, we're going to give you water and food while you wait in a 9-hour line in order to be able to vote, they said, oh no, it is now a crime to provide that assistance. And again, after pushing past a lot of odds and being able to vote, they say, oh, you see, these votes aren't barriers, they're not restrictive, but look at the turnout. We've had these historic turnouts. But what we have done is look under the numbers and compare the white turnout versus the Black turnout. And what we've seen is one of a significant legacy of Shelby County is that Black turnout has been going down since the Shelby County decision. And in Georgia, in Louisiana, in North Carolina, in South Carolina, the Black vote is significantly less than the white vote. And this is what we see as the legacy of Shelby County.
Wow. Dr. Enoch, if you would follow Attorney Johnson's train of thought, it's as if once we get the answer, they change the question. All right. And so that's kind of what took place in that it's nefarious, it's strategic, that they eliminated the means by which we were engaging in the political process. Is it too simplistic to introduce again President Bledsoe's a position that because maybe the demographics is shifting, then maybe they need to have more measures to suppress the vote rather than appealing to people based on political advantages or political interests? They just want to determine who the voters are rather than the voters determine who the leaders are. Is that too simplistic?
It's interesting dynamic that Shelby has introduced across the country. The same way Georgia enacted those kinds of laws, even here in Ohio, they have gone after voter rights to a significant degree after Shelby. For example, in 2013, it was about 16,000 people who were purged from the voter rolls. In Ohio in 2014, about 13,000. After the Shelby decision, they purged about 144,000 people in the major cities in Ohio, which is heavily populated by African Americans. And they did that in 5 different ways. One of the most significant ways that they did that was through gerrymandering, which was protected by the Voter Rights Act prior to Shelby. And they have now gone after, weekend voting and, just a series of other ways that they've been able to disenfranchise African American voters. So the Shelby decision has impacted the entire country, not just Alabama, not just Georgia, but the entire country. And one of the things that these judges know and legislators across the country is that while the legislatures have a number of African Americans represented, states court judges only represent about 4% of African Americans only represent about 4% of states court judges across the country. And Mayor Neal, you brought up the issue of states' rights. And as we all know, we are preparing for the Supreme Court to return a decision that could possibly put all of our elections in the hands of state courts judges, which is, significantly represented by non-African American folks. And so where we have seen a significant drop in African American voters, we stand to see an even greater drop with this potential for this, returning these decisions to the states. And the impact could be tremendous on, states across the country. And it is something that we all need to be cognizant of, because the idea that our justice system is supposed to operate on this colorblind concept. And as we all know, none of us see in a colorblind way. We all see color, we all see race. And in fact, such to the extent that I think it was Attorney Bledsoe who said, that they enact these laws with surgical precision, which means that they are they're targeting African Americans. They're doing these analysis across the country to determine what kinds of policies to enact that are going to significantly disenfranchise African American voters. And that's what we're dealing with. And I think, the important thing that, we have to pay attention to is the fact that when these unjust laws are passed in one state, we have organizations like ALEC that will take that same legislation that maybe was enacted in Alabama or in Georgia or in Florida and Texas, and they'll enact the very same legislation in states across the country. And that's what, something like a Shelby decision or any other unjust law that comes from the Supreme Court can have. That's the impact that it can have on states like Ohio. Here in Ohio, I did my dissertation studies on three women judges who were strategically removed from the bench. Judge Tracy Hunter, Judge Angela Stokes, and Judge Carol Squire. And what I did was looked at the impact of having African American women on the bench in these heavily populated states like Ohio, where they have a trifecta government. And so what that means is that Our governor is Republican, our legislature is Republican, and our court is also a Republican-dominated court, which significantly takes away the power from our voters, from voters. And instead of voters electing their legislatures, when we have gerrymandering and we have all of these laws that have been put in place to disenfranchise voters, we don't stand a chance when we have all of the power brokers who are from one party. And
Well,
that's
let me raise that. Bring everybody up because I want to move into this conversation. You know, President Bledsoe, they're going to say, you know, this is just politics. This has nothing to do with race. You know, we are polarized based on politics. We got two major parties, and people try to, when they're in power, they say, to the victor goes the spoils. And when the Democrats are in power, they structure things to their benefit, and that it's not racially motivated, it's politically motivated. And so that takes away the gerrymandering issue, racial gerrymandering issue. Do they have a point or not?
They really don't have a point. I think that there was the Cooper case out of North Carolina where they were able to go in and show how the treatment of Black Democratic voters was worse than the treatment of white Democratic voters. I think they've been using that as a shield to suggest they're doing these things for partisan reasons. But I think when you take a look at the maps and the way they perform their surgeries, it becomes very evident that what they are doing is they're going after Black voters. For example, we had Dr. Howard Henderson from Texas Southern University to do an analysis of the redistricting in Texas and the movement of voters. And what they were able to find is that there was such an extreme difference between the likelihood of Black voters being moved and white voters being moved and placed in other districts that it had to suggest something nefarious, such as race. I think the standard deviation was something like 15 or so, and normally 2 or 3 standard deviations is enough to raise an issue or a question. And I think that even beyond looking at the maps, I think that we can see what it is. I think what's happened is because of the whole idea behind the strategy that the conservatives have employed for many years, called the Southern strategy, where they have moved so many whites out of the Democratic Party. In many places, there's no difference between the Democratic Party and the minority vote, simply because that's who is now left in the party, because they've done a very effective job of engaging in mass communication, suggesting that the Democratic Party is a party for minorities, and if you're white, it's not for you. And so you find that large percentages of those of the Democratic Party is African American. And I think that it's further revealed if we take a look, for example, at the platforms and the positions that the legislators take who push this legislation. And we'll find that there are things that are specifically designed to hurt one community, not other communities. So when we look at, for example, the disenfranchisement laws that disenfranchise voters, they're not disenfranchising Democrats, they're disenfranchising Black voters and brown voters. And so I think it becomes very clear that this is not about party. They use party as a shield, and the Supreme Court has sadly indicated that they don't really know how to measure when they go too far on partisan gerrymandering. So we've all had to sit down and understand what the best ways were to show that these things were not indeed partisan gerrymanders, but they were racial gerrymanders. And that's why, for example, even Clarence Thomas had issues with some of those matters in the Cooper case. So I think that that's an area that we We understand we're going to be playing in the future because the Supreme Court has punted on the partisanship issue, but it's clearly about race. I think if we look at the underlying reason for why we are here, we've heard this whole thing about the new replacement or displacement theory about minorities being brought in from other countries to displace white voters. And so that's really and truly what's motivating a lot of these nefarious actions. I think if you look at Texas, for example, there's such fear. Texas, for example, now is 59% minority, and the minority population is growing. So the white population has dropped from 45% in 2010 to 41% in 2020, and the minority population continues to increase. So you can see the fear. And so what's actually happening is the reason why we have Shelby County is that the right-wing think tanks and others have been suggesting that there's going to be an overtaking of the government by minorities and we cannot trust them. So we have to engage in shenanigans to make sure that they cannot outvote us. And so therefore, you have to eliminate something such as Section 5 that protects the minority vote, and you come up with some nefarious way in eliminating it. And so now everything is on the playing field. And so it opens up the number of things that they can do to go after minority voters, but make it very clear. And that's one thing I would say too, that we need to educate our legislatures about. I know that too often I hear legislators opposed to some of these horrible redistricting bills, and they're on the floor and they're talking about partisanship. And it's really not about partisanship. It's really about race, because that's who's being disenfranchised here. But the Supreme Court has punted on the partisanship issue. So we need to have a coming together of legislators and others who really support the right of all citizens to vote, to understand that what's occurring in this country is all about race. The evidence is clearly there. The opinion polls show it. You look at the right-wing blogs, they all support that.
Attorney Johnson, you can have intent and then you have effect, right? Which means that you can say that I didn't intend to do it, but the result of what I did was adverse to a population, right? Did the Supreme Court ever look back at its decision, or and really said, well, maybe we did not consider the unintended consequences of that Supreme Court decision?
No, the Supreme Court didn't look back at its decision, but what it did was, when, again, going back to Justice Roberts and Shelby, he said, you have Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. You have this nationwide anti-voter discrimination provision. But what we've seen is that in the Brnovich versus DNC case, the Supreme Court has also weakened that remedy in addressing voter discrimination and addressing the impact of discriminatory voting laws. And what they did there is that they've adopted these very vague, ambiguous standards, Justice Alito called them guidelines, to follow to determine whether there has indeed been a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So with Shelby County, they said, you can't pre-clear, and because of this new doctrine that they put forth called, the sovereignty of the states, but you still have Section 2 to fight voter discrimination. And then in Brnovich versus DNC, they said, well, Section 2, the way you've been applying it is not correct. In looking at the impact and the denial of the vote, and we're going to make it even harder for you to bring Section 2 cases. And so what the court has been doing really is systematically taking away the ability to use the Voting Rights Act. It's increasingly weakening the Voting Rights Act and has not revisited the decision. Now, one way to get the court to revisit the decision is that Congress needs to act. Usually, when the Supreme Court decides on a particular law in a way that Congress didn't intend, then Congress comes back and says, no, court, this is what we want this law to do. And when you look at the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, Congress produced a voluminous record of existing and contemporary voting discrimination. They passed the bill 390 to 33 in the House, unanimously in the Senate. The Supreme Court ignored Congress's work. And so usually what happens in this instance is then Congress says, no, Supreme Court, this is what we meant. And they would pass a law to restore the Voting Rights Act as originally intended. But Congress has abdicated that responsibility. And since the Shelby County decision, has refused to act. Year after year, every Congress, we've been reintroducing the Voting Rights Advancement Act, now the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And unfortunately, we've increasingly become a divided country. And what we're seeing is that the Voting Rights Act, which was this iconic law that was signed, reauthorized and signed back into law with its reauthorizations by Republican presidents, was the pinnacle of a bipartisan bill that transformed American democracy. And now it's become subsumed in this partisan fight that's going on. And so senators and members of Congress who actually voted for its reauthorization are now refusing to pass a bill restoring the full protections of the act. And this is, one of the work that we have to do, is that we have to insist continuously until they act for Congress to restore the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. And of course, it'll be challenged again. It'll go back before the court. But that's why conversations like this is so important, because we have to continually make that record that the voting discrimination continues. And the states have been showing, as they've been doubling down with these restrictive laws, that they're going to continue passing discriminatory voting laws until we have the effective remedy to stop them. So the courts have failed us, Congress has failed us, and it's really up to us, the people, to lift our voices and say, this is not something we'll stand for, and push them to do the right thing.
Councilman Montgomery, do you think that Shelby really understand currently what mess this country is in as a result of that decision? Or did they just think they were doing something just for local convenience? Unmute. There you go.
No, I don't think they really understood this kind of effect. I knew several commissioners that's in our county, and I have always felt that they were good, fair people. I was just really surprised over a challenge that they made at the time. But I don't think some of them believe that the effects that came from that challenge and from the decision of the Supreme Court would have this kind of effect on the country.
Now you won your election afterwards. What, did they go back to the original way that it was drawn, the districts were drawn, or how did they change anything? What do you attribute your winning to?
They changed they didn't accept the redrawn district lines, and what they did accept a sort of an at-large type voting. A position where every council member, every councilor can receive vote from all 5 districts.
So because of the population, because of the way that Clear is populated, do you have a significant African American population? Is what that is?
District 2 was the most of the minorities did live in the second district here in the city, but with such a fast growth that we've had in our city since, especially our population nearly doubled from 2000 to 2008, and then almost doubled again from 2008. From 2010, to until this present time now. But with that kind of growth, this city is the living quarters of our city is really diversified.
Good. I'm concerned, President Bledsoe, that smaller communities are going to be overlooked. They don't have the kind of vigilance and wherewithal to bring lawsuits financially. They are not able to do that. I'm concerned that all over, and not only that, but Native American communities and marginalized communities all over the country are going to be impacted adversely based on this decision, or are currently being impacted adversely concerning this decision. But they don't have the resources to fight. What do we need to do to ensure that those communities are protected as well?
Mr. Mayor, your questions are so insightful. I mean, that is indeed a really, really important question, because you have hit the nail on the head. What Marcia said earlier, Ms. Johnson Blanco, the whole thing about how Section 5 operates. Before we could simply write an objection letter with some facts and details that would allow DOJ to take a look at a change in any kind of election practice and say, you need to prove that this is not discriminatory and actually call it to a halt. Now that's changed. And so when she says that the Supreme Court points out Section 2, what that means is you need to be able to generate a lawsuit that goes to court, and you generally don't win on our side until after the whole matter has been resolved. Every now and then you'll get some preliminary injunctive relief, but that's somewhat rare on our side nowadays. So what you have to do is you have to generate the funding in order to bring the lawsuit. And so in larger urban communities where there are more stakes involved, they have more resources there, more monies that are usually available. So they can usually avail themselves of being able to either get experts, private counsel, and because of the additional, the greater impact that's there, many of the fine national voting rights organizations that litigate 24/7, those organizations are more likely to handle cases in those areas. So that leaves out the smaller communities around our country. And the kinds of things that they do are so nefarious, whether it's changing a polling site overnight, so people go to the wrong polling site, or whether it's putting racist individuals in charge of polling sites to discourage Black folks, or putting polling places adjacent to sheriff's offices so as to discourage individuals from voting, whether it requires some impediment such as remembering what you used on your voter application form 40, 50 years ago when you applied for a voter registration application before you can vote absentee. So elderly voters are disenfranchised because they don't remember which one they use. If you use the wrong one, there's a very slow process that's designed to stop you. So it happens time and again. And the likelihood of these types of shenanigans being done, we've seen since Shelby County and smaller community, has occurred more and more and more, including the whole idea of changing the electoral district so that you could take away minority electoral districts. So that's happening more and more. So what we need to do is we need to have a situation where, number one, Congress needs to, and I wish that it had been done a few years ago before we had a change in the House, but they needed to provide a whole lot more lawyers. They provided some more, but they needed to give a lot more compensation to DOJ. So that DOJ Civil Rights Division is going to be able to get out there and do more Section 2 type litigation. I think number two, we need to engage in fundraising efforts to help all the great law firms like Lawyers Committee, LDF, and others around the country, Southern Coalition, all those great entities to get more funding so they can expand. But they can't do it all around the country. So the other thing we need to do is maybe like with the NAACP leading the effort in our great national legal counsel office and legal and national office, leading the effort to train up NBA members and other lawyers that have an interest or an aptitude for this type of litigation, so they can go out and join with these great law firms. I know what I initially did when I started in these situations. I always joined with one of those voting rights firms if I could persuade them to join the litigation, because they knew the law and matters that I was not aware of and that you learn over time. So I think that there needs to be a partnership. We need to get more lawyers out there. We need to be able to do all those things. And the final thing, I think, is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that Ms. Johnson mentioned earlier. That one deserves an independent vote. What's kind of missing the eye with many people is that it was only voted on in a combined vote when it was voted on back in 2021. It never got an independent vote. And so we need to push for that, because I think it's got a much greater chance than having some omnibus legislation that eliminates Citizens United being passed at the same time. Because Citizens United is something there's no way to get the far right to move away from that. But we have some nibbles from conservatives that might support the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So we need to push that as well.
You mentioned about, placing people in the same district. Is that called stacking and packing, kind of a strategy by which you put all minorities in one district so they can have a representative, but do not have influence over the other districts? Is that the new strategy, Dr. Enoch or Dr. Johnson? I mean, Attorney Johnson. Is that what they're doing? Is that part of the new strategy?
That's one of the new strategies, Manuel. There are
also, I want to let people know that you ran for Congress and that you were the Democratic nominee in Ohio. So you kind of know how these things work as well.
Right. And there are, we've mentioned some of the strategies, but there are numerous strategies. What they did was looked at what the Democratic behavior is and Black voter behavior is in terms of how they register to vote and when they register to vote, and whether they have an ID, what type of an ID that they have. So African Americans, we don't in Ohio tend to have gun permits, and across the country, really, because we have a higher population of individuals who have been incarcerated and disenfranchised, but a gun permit, and in addition to an ID, is permitted to vote here in Ohio. Whereby, there used to be a number of ways that a number of IDs that could be used for voting purposes. Students, for example, could use their student ID to vote, and a number of valid IDs, and they have limited those to certain types of IDs. And in terms of voter registration, it's limited in terms of the time that people have to register to vote before an election. They've limited the number of days that folks can go to the polls. So these kinds of strategies have been employed across the country. And one thing I think is important to note here is that all of these things came about after Barack Obama won the presidency. as a form of backlash. And in fact, in the North Carolina case that the NAACP brought, one of the things that Judge Motz, who was the judge who oversaw that case, she presided over that case, pointed out and identified is that it was only after the Black vote gained parity in terms of the turnout percentage, the number of African Americans who were showing up at the polls to vote almost gained parity, and the number of African Americans who were registering to vote had almost gained parity with whites, that they began to employ these various strategies to keep African Americans from being able to wield any power in these elections. And so what you know, to your point, the stacking and cracking and packing and all of those kinds of things, where they concentrate all of the African Americans in a very small area so that they don't wield much legislative power, all of those various kinds of strategies that are now being employed have created a situation where Blacks did have power of the vote, and they could elect legislators that might have their best interest at heart. Those kinds of strategies reduce the amount of power that African Americans have across the country. And so where I mentioned ALEC, which is a legislative body that pushes forth very conservative, very racist bills across the country. ALEC is active and busy, implementing these strategies across the country. So one of the things that we do have to pay attention to is the fact that the high incarceration rate that disenfranchised African American voters across the country was one of the strategies. But there are states that are implementing other kinds of strategies. Like, for example, if folks protest police beatings and killings at the hands of police officers against unarmed Black men and women, those instances, you have found judges who have taken away the right to vote as a result of that. And there are several strategies that are being implemented, and they're being implemented nationwide. So this is really a problem that isn't concentrated in any one place. And it's not just one strategy. It's several strategies that all work together to ultimately dilute the Black vote, no matter where you are in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. It seems to be, a strange thing that the courts, which are supposed to be blind, that justice is blind, has been politicized. And so I want to ask my panel about the politicization of our courts. You are tuned in to a Shelby conversation. This is we're now at halftime. We have been talking about the Shelby County versus Holder decision that did away with the pre-clearance clause of the Voters' Rights Act of 1965. And so now we're discussing how the effects of that particular decision is manifesting itself, not only in those original states that were subject to pre-clearance, but also has proliferated around the country, and that other states have been given the red flag or the green light, if you will, to enact voter suppression measures to dominate the electoral process. So now I know you have attorneys on the line. If we as laymen, if we conclude that the courts are political entities, right? Does that take away from any decision that the court makes now, not just with the Shelby versus Holder, but the court's supposed to be neutral and supposed to look at the Constitution and apply whatever to the Constitution. Is that where we are, or is Dr. Enoch correct when she said when President Obama was elected, they said that we have to up our game in terms of voter suppression? And either one of you can be can chime in on that.
Mayor, before they chime in, I want to just say this with regard to the courts. And I think it was Attorney Bledsoe who mentioned activist judges, which, I think we've always seen activist judges, but there is this this concept of impartiality that is a concept that judges are supposed, the bench as a whole is supposed to ascribe to. However, what we found is in my research is that although there's this concept of impartiality, the bench is not impartial at all. We're dealing with people who come from a certain ideology and mindset, and they bring those mindsets and those ideologies into the court. Mm-hmm. And in this round of selection of Supreme Court justices, we had the opportunity in a front row seat to see the impact of just putting a Black woman on the bench and all that she had to go through because of the fear of allowing her ideology and her mindset to be part of that court. They hadn't had in a very long time an African American who was not a conservative on that bench. And so for her to come to that bench with a different mindset, a different ideology, mm-hmm. it upsets the apple cart and the status quo. But I think that when you have Barack Obama, who as president, he had put more Democratic judges on the bench than any other president before him, more African Americans. And now we have Joe Biden, who has also put more African Americans on the bench. We still have a dynamic where there's, the bench, only 4% of all of the judges on the bench are African American. That's a significant issue. And even fewer of those are, Democratic judges. So you've got a double ideology issue there. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, and they can pick up.
I know that when you have attorneys and they all have to go before judges, that sometimes that's a challenge. But if the perception of the general populace is that the court is politically skewed, mm-hmm. then does that take away from this notion of justice? And can we truly believe in the system of justice if we see it being so politicized? And I guess that's the question that I'm asking.
Well, Marcia, if you don't want it, I'll touch that one.
I can start off and then I'll hand it over to you. No, I think what we're seeing with the courts right now is a crisis of legitimacy. And as, Dr. Enoch said, that, we're coming out of the previous administration that was very active. Dr. Enoch mentioned the Obama and the Biden administration, but the Trump administration has really reshaped the Supreme Court, right? And so now we have a Supreme Court whose judicial philosophy is to view rights as narrowly as possible. Their philosophy is if Congress passed a law and did not explicitly say this is what the law addresses, generally the way it works is Congress passes the law and then the body that's responsible for enforcing that law determines the process and the procedures and how the law is going to be enforced. And what this court is now saying, if the Congress did not say explicitly this is how it has to be done, then that agency doesn't have the authority to enforce the law. This court is also saying that organizations such as mine is suggesting, right? And I believe it was Justice Gorsuch who's put this into the ether there, that there may not be a private right of action under the Voting Rights Act. And so organizations like mine that for 60 years has been enforcing the Voting Rights Act shouldn't be allowed to do so. We have a Supreme Court that is saying there are several justices in the Supreme Court who are saying there's this theory, independent state legislature theory, that says that state courts can't rule on districts drawn by state legislatures for federal seats. So taking away the right of review of the state courts, while not providing a similar right of review through the federal law. And so we are confronting a judiciary that is now having this orientation of really viewing the laws that they're allowing to exist and remain in the most narrow form possible. And so we have that crisis of legitimacy on the federal side. And then on the state side, judges are elected. And while in name those races are nonpartisan, again, they're very clear political perspectives, as Dr. Enoch said, that these judges bring to the table. And it's really remarkable that now in North Carolina, the previous Supreme Court that had a Democratic majority struck down racially gerrymandered districts. And after the election, and that court now has a Republican majority, they're now rehearing the case that had been decided before. And lastly, just to add to the parade of horrors, is that, we have a Supreme Court that doesn't have to really follow any ethical guidelines as other federal courts do. So we have a Justice Thomas who is opining on actions that his wife was involved in. And I'm referring to the January 6th insurrection. So, across the board, we're really facing these challenges that with our courts, and really have to ask ourselves really hard questions about, is this something we want to take to the courts to get remedied? Because right now, the way the courts are positioning themselves, that's not the place for recourse as it has been in the past. President Bledsoe.
Yeah. Well said, Attorney Johnson. Go ahead, President Bledsoe.
Okay, great. I couldn't agree more with those words, and also with Dr. Enoch. Let me put it this way, though. I think in how we have to look at the court. Everyone brings their philosophy with them when they go to the court. Like we always talk about what value Thurgood Marshall brought to the court, and even Justice O'Connor talked about how he was able to help shape and change decisions because of things he knew and had experienced. And so all those things are important. We know some judges will come with a a progressive liberal type disposition and others with a conservative disposition. What's going on now is what we see played out so much in reference to some of the comments we've heard former President Trump talk about, where he expects because he appointed someone that they must therefore decide for him. You see, that's we're moving into another realm, because in the past, what we have always tried to do is to understand that, like when Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley and others would appear before the court, there were some very conservative courts that they appeared before, but they won. So you have to understand that they had to be looking for some core of decency or humanity within them to be able to reach. And so the question for us is, how can we package or our cases and present them in a way where we can get 5 votes, because there must be humanity within them to begin with. Now, let's take race cases. Race cases are going to be somewhat problematic because, Chief Justice Roberts, who is probably one of the more likely ones to take a position different from the extreme conservatives there, he is much more likely to take an action if the case involves an LGBTQ issue or some issue that, like the Affordable Care Act, things like that, that are not related to African Americans. He's just not had a good record on any kind of 5-4, 6-3 decisions that involve Black folks. So that's kind of a real problem, and that one of our more likely votes to move over. But I think Kavanaugh, one of the things that's very interesting, I read a law review article that Kavanaugh did when he was in law school, talking about the wonders of Batson versus Kentucky and wrongfully striking Black jurors. And Kavanaugh has been someone, I think we need to study the jurisprudence. But I think that, for example, what Attorney Johnson mentioned earlier about Justice Gorsuch, he's seeming to be extremely conservative. There's no way to get him. Now, we know that Scalia was a certain way he would speak out and was overt about his issues on race. And we know right now in the court, Alito is always going to be a vote against us. And we know that not only does Gorsuch say there's not a private right of action, but Clarence Thomas believes that as well. So they've got 2 votes on the Supreme Court that believe that. We have to start looking at, and I don't know on these issues about Connick Barrett, if there's any way, she hadn't really shown the real propensity to be someone who moves away from that group. She has maybe once or twice, from my recollection. So, but we've got to be sophisticated to package argument, and we shouldn't punt, because I look at when they were winning cases early on with those very conservative judges. I know, for example, that when Charles Hamilton Houston argued the Missouri ex-Real Gaines case before the Supreme Court, there was one justice that was so racist that he turned towards the back and looked at the wall while Houston argued the case. And so, they had to deal with that kind of just clear, overt, over the top racism. And so we can deal with what they're putting out against us today. We just have to try to think of what people have decency and which ones are political hacks. I mean, I can remember during Shelby County, Scalia kept saying things out loud to anger people. And finally, my good friend and white colleague who was sitting next to me shouted out, "No, you didn't. No, you didn't." So, and the guards moved towards us, and I just knew they're going to figure the Black guy did, and they're going to throw me out of the Supreme Court. But, that wasn't what happened. But, we just have to look at and handicap with the judges that we have there.
It's interesting that you made that statement. I'm interested, Councilman Montgomery, is how much knowledge or forewarning did you all have about what the county commissioners were going to do? Did they have public meetings? Tell us, to what extent was the county and the citizens of Shelby County aware of what happened?
No, there wasn't any forewarning. Didn't know anything about it. I think from what I learned and what I heard afterwards, that it was mainly inspired from outside of our state and use our, use our county basically for the ground floor to make the challenge. But from what I was told and what I learned, that it was really kind of speared up from outside the state from others.
So they used the leadership in Shelby County as kind of pawns to be the front, the face of what was happening, but the influence was behind that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The point of the matter is, to what extent do I think about communities, and I think about the legacy of communities, and I think about how Shelby would want people to view it, and I often ask myself, well, how would Shelby want to be remembered 100 years from now, 200 years from now? Would it want to be remembered as the county that was the existential threat to democracy? It was the county that assaulted our democracy to the point that it no longer exists in terms of this vision that our foreparents and forefathers and founders had? Or would it want to be a county that recognized that the errors were not in the best interest of maintaining and sustaining our democracy, and that would want to stand up and say, not in our name? I often ask that question. I want to ask that people, you can put in the chat any questions. I saw that we had a comment that says diversity is a threat for some people, and so we mentioned that we are moving into a more polarized racial space than we have in many years. I can recall the Colonel report in the late 60s that was trying to do an assessment of the racial condition of America and the racial tension. And the report came back with a kind of simple uh, explanation as to what was happening. It said we're moving towards two Americas, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And I think if we were to take that same study today, would we come back with similar conclusions? And that's what I want to talk about now. How does race play a part in this? And then I want to have the conversation about what are the solutions. I mean, we can sit here and restate the problem over and over again. And I think it's important that we kind of assess the problem and dissect it and then derive solutions as a consequence of that. But I want us to start thinking now on what are the permanent and more sustainable solutions to what Shelby has done to our democracy. And I'm going to talk about it from the vantage point of legislation. Let me go back to you, Dr. Enoch, in terms of, now we have and it was President Bledsoe said that now we have, no, I think it was Attorney Johnson said, now we have a Republican House and you have a Democratic Senate. So, what we were trying to do in the House probably won't go through now, given the construct of Congress. So what do we do if we cannot codify legislation that gives us a greater degree of permanence in terms of our voters' rights? If not through legislation, what do we do, if anything?
Yeah, I think I think we have a 2-year time frame where we have to get organized and get folks back to the polls before we have another Trump or Trump-like administration coming into power. But as far as being able to get any of the legislation that we've mentioned on here, like the George Floyd Act and various kinds of voter rights bills passed, I think that this particular administration, when we look at who we're dealing with, the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene or Kevin McCarthy, who really, for a lack of a better word, does not have much of a spine or power with this administration. We don't. I don't think we can expect to get a whole lot done with this administration. I think that the work will be to ensure that we set ourselves up for success with the new administration, getting people in a position to where they are able to vote and able to um, do some things to shift the balance of power. For example, if our folks don't have IDs, we need to be about the business of making sure that we encourage people to get out there and get IDs. And if they're not registered to vote, that we get them out there, get them registered early, and really position ourselves for what is to come. Because in this current administration, in this current environment that we're in, where they're taking Black folks out of school books, these are changes that are going to happen and that are going to be systemic, and they're going to impact us for generations to come. And that's what they're preparing for. They're strategizing for the next generation. They're not just looking at the here and the now, and we need to be doing that as well. You know, there was a time in this country when our history wasn't being taught in schools, that we were uh, operating Saturday schools to make sure that our children learn their history and that they understand the impact of, you know, their skin complexion on how they navigate life. And I think we have to get back to a time where we are training our children, but we have to start with training adults. You know, there are many adults who don't know our history. And, you know, a people who does not know their history is doomed to repeat it, right? And we have some things, I think, in history we don't want to see repeated, or we shouldn't want to see repeated, but we're seeing it. You know, this idea of banning books and censorship is not a new concept. In fact, when we were brought to this country in chains, we were not allowed to learn about who we were and to, you know, continue speaking the language that we spoke prior to coming to the US. So we have to be about the business of also strategizing. At one point in this country, maybe about 20 or 30 years ago, we were hosting think tanks, and we were all about making sure that we educate our people. And I think that that is critical at this point right now, where Rosa Parks is no longer an African American in in some school books across the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that plan is being rolled out, as I've said before, all over the U.S. You know, not just in those places we're seeing on the news. Here in Westchester, Ohio, the school board has some very active conservatives that are trying to get rid of everything Black, that, you know, everything in any school book, and they're getting rid of the Black History Month and everything possible to ensure that our kids have a particular ideology going forward for years and generations to come.
You know, it's interesting, uh, President Bledsoe. I want to talk about the Fannie Lou Hamer spirit that many people find themselves. They're sick and tired of being sick and tired. How do you continue to motivate people or to encourage people to engage in a process that we have articulated as being so flawed? I mean, the messaging to our people, how do we do that? I can see our people can get very discouraged and cynical about the entire system and withdraw from the system, which is antithetical to what we know as our best interest. How do we respond to that?
Well, the number one argument that I use, or whether it's in a speech or whether I'm talking to young people strategizing, like the other day when I was talking to the head of our youth and college division, my point was this: I look at our ancestors. I look at what our ancestors went through. I look at how they had to bow their heads to horrible human beings, how they had to endure the most inhumane living conditions, and how they persevered so that we who descended from them would have a better life, a better day. And so I tell them, if they respect their ancestors, if they really want to make it to where their lives were meaningful, then they really have an obligation to be there and to be part of the solution, because what we're fighting today, and all these individuals that are spouting the racial invectives, they're nothing compared to what they had to endure. And so I think it's a matter of honor. You know, you hear people talk about that in some of the old films about honor. This is really honor. We have to honor our ancestors because they went through tons for us. So that's what I say. And I say, secondly, my second argument, and this final one I mentioned, is that we can win this, because you look at what they went through. How could you ever have thought, if you were a slave in 1835, that you would ever see you or your ancestors being free in this country?
Mm-hmm.
But they continued with the vigilance, and the people that supported them continue with the vigilance. You know, Martin Luther King had that comment about the moral arc of the universe being long, but it bends towards justice. But of course, it doesn't bend towards justice unless, of course, we're out there trying to bend it, and the other side's out there trying to bend it back the other way. I think we thought after the gains we made in the 60s and 70s that those things were etched in stone, and we were just talking about making the country better, not realizing that the bigots of the world were going to be acting all the time. So what we have to come to understand is be a little bit different, because we're sometimes so forgiving and so likely to look at the other person in a positive way. But we have to understand that sometimes in those smiling faces, as the old OJ said, smiling faces can be somewhat devastating. And those smiling faces are really trying to subjugate us and put us into some kind of third-class citizenship or what have you. And we need to understand that and make no bones about it. And so we know we can win this. Thurgood Marshall won cases they never thought they could have won. Have their record was just incredible under the circumstances. So we can win, but you have to believe, and you need to be part of the solution, or else you're dishonoring your ancestors.
Attorney Johnson, give me some hope. I mean, we've articulated and enumerated many of the challenges. How do we out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope? How do we hew a stone of hope out of this mountain of despair?
I would say that we need to start at home. You know, often when we think about our democracy and voting, we look to the federal government, but there's a lot that we can do in our local governments, with our state governments. You know, these are the elections that don't have the amount of participation that they should, and they're the elections that really affect our lives on a daily basis. And, you know, the right has recognized this. This is why they're taking over our school boards and our city councils. And President Bledsoe mentioned about, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston and the fight. And the thing is, we have fought successfully for our rightful place in this democracy from the very beginning. And we've won. And sometimes it's taken a while, whether it's, over a year for the Montgomery bus boycott to be successful. But we win. When we fight, we win. That's what our history tells us. And we should start fighting from the local all the way to the federal government. And so this is a challenge for us, but it's not one that's insurmountable because we have the talent, the grit, the tenacity to keep at it and fight. And I really like that framing that President Bledsoe did about honoring our ancestors, because they went through unspeakable horrors, but they did it for us, and we owe it for the generations to come to keep fighting. And like I said, whenever we fight, we win. We just have to commit to the fight.
Yeah. Councilman Montgomery, I was always told that this experiment, this pluralistic experiment, this democracy was at the cornerstone of what this nation was about, what we espouse towards. Do you think that there are people who are white people who really believe in democracy and will join with us in saving democracy? And then we can fight about policy issues and those things, but at least let's save democracy so we'll have something to fight, some parameters to fight for.
Yes, I think there are more. I think there are more people that would really are willing to stand for democracy than to just buy into the ideology of what's going on, that things should be this way or that way. And as you would mention about the hope, my hope is, when I look at it, my hope is in our younger people. I think as many tries to hide things from them, take things, or try to change history, I think that generation is becomes more driven to learn the truth instead of just accepting what has just been told to them. So I'm hopeful about the younger generation. I think they will change it. I feel optimistic in the future.
Well, I appreciate you doing that. You make me feel better, Councilman. What we're going to have to do as we begin to keep this conversation on the forefront, we have to make sure that we are having these conversations in our own sphere of influence, social media. We are going to be, and let me promote this, and I probably should have been promoting it the whole show, that we're going to Shelby County between June the 23rd through June 25th. Technically, we're going back to the scene of the crime. And we will have a 3-day full events to take place. The first day, which is that Friday on the 23rd, we will have a rally and a march to the courthouse where that decision was made, followed by a gathering of food and entertainment right adjacent to the courthouse. We will have the next day of full entertainment as well as information and panel discussions about various issues that are germane to healthy democracy. And so we will be on the campus of Montevallo that entire day and the following day. But we will have many people coming in, many groups coming in to strategize, to develop a strategic plan, to move forward, to resuscitate and to rejuvenate our democracy. And we also will have a concert. We're finalizing the artists now, but it's going to be a concert because we believe that any movement has to have music. And we don't want this to be just a moment. We want it to be a movement. We want to have a continuation of this conversation as we move forward so that our children will not go to sleep. And it was uh, uh, Coretta Scott King that told me one time that the greatest failing of the civil rights movement that she saw a lot of times we gave our children the victories of the struggle, but we didn't give them the struggle. And we know that Dr. King said that each generation has the responsibility to address the concerns of its time. So we're going to have young people there sitting down at the table on the panel so that they can engage in the conversation. It won't be a monologue of us talking to people. It'll be a dialogue that we can talk with each other. And then finally, I believe that you seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all of the other things will be added unto you. We will have an ecumenical day. That's Sunday. That's the actual day. It just falls on Sunday that the Supreme Court decision came down. Will be an ecumenical service with spiritual leaders from around the country, followed by a gospel concert. And so that kind of encapsulates the full weekend that we're having, the Shelby Democracy Weekend. All right. So what I want to do now, because I know that we have a lot to do, but I have two people that I want to bring up, and I want to give them some time. Let me before I even do that. You all are an amazing panel. I just want to thank you all so much for pouring your heart out and just an authentic conversation, which is what we must have. And so thank you so much for sharing with us. I want to bring up the president of the Shelby County NAACP, uh, uh, President Shields. How are you doing? Unmute, please.
Sorry, I'm good. I had a few technical difficulties early on, but I'm here.
What your
And I have,
president accounted for.
yeah, yes. I've so enjoyed the conversation thus far. And it is just, everything was just as, it was so educational, for those of us or for those may be listening, who may be listening that hadn't had a full understanding of what went on with Shelby v. Holder. It's been very educational, and I hope to hear more.
Oh, absolutely. And we thank you for all the work that you do. As you know, coming to Shelby County, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the ground to when people are coming to your house, you all are having to prepare for us to come. And so I want to thank you in advance and the team on the scene, the Shelby team, for all the work that you all are doing. And so is it anything that you need from us to assist you in preparing to receive this nation and maybe people from around the world to Shelby County?
Yeah, we will certainly ask. If we do at this point, I think we're working well together and putting pieces together to that we'll need at that time. So we're working hard on those things. Of course, we're at the beginning of that, but we're getting it done.
Good.
And I have some very enthusiastic people, workers who are just as determined as I am to see that this thing is successful in June, and that we truly make an impact on the nation and the world as we attempt to motivate people to do as you say, make this a movement.
Yeah. You know, you live in Shelby County, obviously, and I just want to know from your perspective, Madam President, how does Shelby County view what has taken place, and what can we do to energize Shelby County, both of all persuasions,
Yeah.
to not want this to be a stain on your name?
Well, it's difficult to say because there's so many different people at varying levels of living, of existence, and some just don't even have time to figure it out or understand it. And I wish those are the people I would like to reach. There are those who feel that, you know, they have made it, and, you know, they have no real interest in changing things. But I think that's because in a lot of cases they have not looked far enough ahead to what could happen if we lose this democracy. Because there are a lot of people that are not just against our existence, but against our advancement, against our education, against our becoming affluent. And I believe our eyes are closed, some of our eyes are closed to that. And we need to open those eyes as well. But that's the apathy that exists, you know, within this county that we must address. And some people are so busy dealing with the day-to-day issues of living because it's so they're living below the poverty level already. That their issue is getting, you know, food.
Right.
So, but you know, there are different levels of society here, and we just haven't gotten them as interested as the Republican Party has gotten its people. While we're trying to strategize on policy, you know, they're developing a way to keep us from voting, or to keep our people, you know, from going out to actually participate in government, because the goal is to, as you know, disenfranchise all of us.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for all you do, President Shields, both seen and unseen. And we appreciate the hospitality in advance that we will receive from Shelby County. We are inviting everyone who are lovers of democracy to come to Shelby County between June 23rd and June 25th. And we will then come together to figure out collectively how we're going to save our democracy, believing that we all are possessors of some truth. And as we bring our truths together, then and only then do we get closer to the truth. Thank you so much, President Shields.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Good. All right. I want to bring up the state president of the NAACP, President Bernard Simonton. I've been working with this leader now for a minute now, and I'm so inspired by his passion for justice and equality, and for the maintenance and sustainability of our democracy. And so, Mr. President, what's your thoughts about this evening, and where do we go from here? As Dr. King said, chaos or community?
Thank you, Mayor Neal. And certainly thank you for moderating this panel, and also thank the panel members for their insight in talking about voting rights and democracy, because they are certainly linked together. And I want to also thank all those who joined us on Facebook, and thank those who are working behind the scene to make this happen. Jolie and Justice, who you all don't see them, but they're putting this together to make it happen. I want to thank those. And to our distinguished panel, I don't know if y'all had any closing comments or not, but again, I want to thank you for setting the tone for this event, this democracy, reclaiming our democracy event. You know, I was in the Supreme Court arguments when Shelby was argued. And I heard Justice Scalia say something to the effect that, do we think that voting rights is some kind of racial entitlement? And that really hit to the core of what we were there for, is to make sure that we maintain our voting rights. And it has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with our constitutional rights that we will guarantee in the 14th, 15th Amendment to the Constitution. But, you know, because of laws that states like Alabama passed that tried to limit the vote, such as things as passing, having people to have a requirement to do poll taxes, or to pass some type of literacy test, that many of you that are probably listening don't know anything about that. But I remember my parents having to pay poll taxes in order to vote. And so it's not a racial entitlement. It's a human and constitutional right as a citizens of the United States. And so, again, I want to thank our partner organizations, ACIJ, League of Women Voters, ACLU of Alabama, and the National NAACP and other organizations for supporting us. And we want to also ensure that you join us in June 23rd through the 25th in Shelby County, where we meet together and bring together people across the country and across the world that are talking about democracy, are talking about the right to vote. But more importantly, we want to come up with a plan of how we're going to protect what we have and then get back what we lost. We want to protect what we have and then get back what we've lost, because we lost a lot in Shelby. And I think it was Attorney Johnson who mentioned that, someone mentioned that in a day now we could hear the results of an argument that the NAACP is part of in the Milligan versus Murrow case, or Murrow versus Milligan, where we are hoping that the Supreme Court will see the redistricting plan that the state of Alabama came up with. It was racially biased, and that it took away really the rights of many people to elect the person of their choice when it comes to congressional districts in the state of Alabama, and really depend on how they rule across this nation. And I know there are several other court cases across the country that are waiting to see what this decision is, to see where they go from here. But the thing that we really want you to take away from this first part of these 3 series of webinars is that we want to get prepared for future elections. I know there are some state and municipal elections this year in the state of Alabama and across this nation. And we need to make sure that we are at the polling place when those doors open. And for our young people, we need you all to step up and to be a part of this process, and not sit back and say, well, I don't see anything to vote for. Well, if you don't see anything to vote for, someone else is voting for you. And so it's important that we just get to the polls on election day, whether that's in Alabama, whether that's in California, New York, or wherever, because voting is so important. And then we're going to take what we learn on the 23rd through the 25th, and we're going to share that with our community. And so that we can have a strategy of how we're going to get people to the polls in 2024 and really 2024 and beyond, because we want this to be something that we continuously utilize year to year when we have to vote. And I've read some of the comments online, and some of them said, you know, there are white people that are concerned about the election process. And so we are asking everyone to join with us, no matter your race, no matter, you know, your sexual preference. We want you all to help fight for the vote and fight for the right of all citizens to vote, and in particular, African American who are discriminated against on a daily basis because of no more than the color of their skin. And so again, thank you, Mayor, and thank all those who participated in this event. And as Dr. King said, we can't wait. We can't wait until a future date. We have to do that starting now. So thank you very much.
Good. And I also want, before you leave, Mr. President, I also want to make an appeal to people to financially support us as well. If you could make that appeal, because it's going to take resources in order to do this. Right. And so if I want to make sure where we have a few minutes to make the appeal to people to help us financially to do this.
Right. The event that we are planning to host in Shelby County, 23 through 24, 25 June rather, it will cost money. And I know there are some people who have committed to it, some organization who have committed to support us, but we don't have the funds that we need at this point to finish the planning. And so we need to see those dollars coming in. And we didn't put this on just to, you know, get you all to donate, but for those who will and those who can, you can donate in several ways. One is to go to our website, and that website is alnaacp.org, and just click on the donate button. And when you click on it, there's a box in there where you can put, it's for the Shelby Day event. And, you know, you may want to put something, I'm donating this for my grandparents or my parents who, you know, suffered because of the lack of ability to get to the polls. Or you can send a check. You can send it to our address at P.O. Box 866, Athens, Alabama 35612. And I think Justice will be able to put that up a little later, but send it to P.O. Box 866, Athens, Alabama 35612. And we know that freedom is not free. Mm-hmm. And equality is not free. So we must fight, and we will continue to fight. We are not going to give up. And so thank you, Mayor, for asking us to do that and put that appeal up. And we just need you all to support us and turn out in June in Shelby County.
Good. Thanks. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Well, man, this has been an incredible time that we've had today. This is, as the president said, this is just the first of a series of conversations that we're going to have about Shelby. We're going to talk about, you know, the importance of collaborating, of working together across lines of division for the sake of the maintenance and sustainability of our democracy. It is a saying that once you know, then you owe. To whom much is given, much is required. And so we are at a a watershed moment. We're at a pivotal moment in our sojourn in this country. And so I'm appealing to all lovers of democracy. This is a clarion call for all lovers of democracy to meet us in Shelby County on June 23rd through June 25th of this year. And we are going to reason together. We're going to come together and we're going to develop strategies that will maintain, resuscitate, and rejuvenate our democracy. Thank you all so much. I'd like to thank my guest for being with us today. I'd like to thank Mr. Attorney Aston from the General Counsel's Office of the NAACP national level. I would like to thank Ernest Montgomery, who is the city council person in Calais, which is in Shelby County. And he was the basis of, or the genesis of the Shelby getting involved in this. I'd like to thank President Gary Bledsoe, who is the president of the NAACP in Texas, for his contribution. I'd like to thank Dr. Vanessa Enoch, who also is from Cincinnati, Ohio, that area, and who had run for Congress and really was able to frame it in her dissertation, the Shelby decision. So thank her for her contribution. And lastly, Attorney Marcia Johnson, thank you for how you were able to frame the issue. I'm so happy that you all were able to join with us on our first Shelby conversation. We look forward to having you join us on our next Shelby conversation. And I've been doing radio now for 33 years. And as always, I leave my audience with these two words. Remember that I love you with a perfect love. But more importantly, remember this: you got the power. Until our next Shelby conversation, have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.